The government just put a tariff on goods from China. So why are you the one paying more for it? That's not a rhetorical question. It's the actual mechanism behind almost everything you're about to see in this video. Prices went up this year. Electronics, clothes, cars, furniture. Most people assume that's just inflation. Some vague economic weather system nobody controls. Some of it is tariffs, doing exactly what they're designed to do. So let's actually trace the money, step by step. Let's find out who's really paying for this. Let's start with the basics, because most explanations skip this part. What is a tariff, really? Strip away the politics for a second. A tariff is a tax. Specifically, a tax on goods coming into a country from somewhere else. Here's the simplest possible example. A company imports a box of goods worth $100. The government adds a 20% tariff. That box now costs $120 before it even leaves the port. That extra $20 doesn't vanish. It goes to the government as tax revenue. And that $120 cost has to go somewhere in the chain that follows. Which brings us to the question most people get wrong. Who actually pays a tariff? If you ask most people, they'll say China, or whichever country the tariff targets. That's not how it actually works. Here's the real order of operations. The tariff is paid, upfront, in cash, by the American company importing the goods, not the Chinese factory, not the Chinese government. The importer, sitting in the US, writes the check to US Customs. That happens the moment the container clears the port. An economics professor at Babson College put it about as plainly as it can be put. When firms import goods, they pay the cost upfront. Then what happens? The importer has three basic choices: absorb the cost and take a smaller profit margin, pass the cost forward by raising the price the consumer pays, or some blend of both. Multiple economic surveys have tracked this over the past 2 years. They've found the same result over and over. Most of that cost gets passed forward, eventually, to the person buying the product, you. So when you hear we're taxing China, here's what's actually happening. The US government is taxing an American company for the crime of buying something made overseas, and that American company quietly passes most of that tax on to American shoppers. Now, businesses aren't just sitting there and eating this cost passively. They're responding in three main ways. First, the obvious one, raising prices. This is the most direct. It's also the one that shows up fastest. Second, cutting costs elsewhere to offset the tariff. Cheaper packaging. Smaller product sizes without changing the price, sometimes called shrinkflation. Squeezing suppliers for better deals. Third, and this is the big structural one, moving supply chains entirely. Apple is a great example of this in motion. Apple has already shifted somewhere between 15 and 20% of its production to India and Vietnam, specifically to reduce exposure to US-China tariffs. That move has cost Apple over $1 billion in new Indian manufacturing investment alone. And it hasn't been simple. Vietnam's supply chain bottlenecks pushed lead times up, roughly 10% longer for some products right in the middle of the transition. Ford tells a similar story from the other direction. Ford imports steel and aluminum for its US factories. Tariffs on those materials have added real cost per vehicle, somewhere between $500 and $1,000 for every single vehicle Ford builds domestically. Ford's response has been to lean harder into Mexican suppliers. Labor costs there run 20 to 30% lower than in China. That offsets some of the new cost elsewhere in the chain. HP did something similar with electronics. It shifted sourcing to Taiwan and Thailand. That reportedly cut costs by about 8%. There's an older example worth remembering too, because it shows this isn't new behavior. Before the 2019 US-China tariff escalation, major retailers like Walmart and Target increased inventory ahead of the deadline, specifically to avoid the higher import costs. That stockpiling led to its own problems. Logistics bottlenecks, warehouse shortages, inefficient use of capital, tied up in inventory nobody needed yet. None of these moves are free. They cost money, time, and operational headaches. That's exactly why companies don't make them casually. Only when the tariff pain is big enough to justify the disruption. Now, here's where this video needs to be fair. It's easy to make tariffs sound like purely bad policy. They're not that simple. The US government has real, specific reasons for using them anyway. Reason 1, manufacturing. Tariffs make imported goods more expensive. That should make domestically made goods more competitive by comparison. In theory, that brings factory jobs back to the US. Reason 2, national security. Certain materials are considered too risky to import from foreign suppliers. Steel, semiconductors, pharmaceutical ingredients, especially from countries that could become adversaries in a future conflict. Reason 3, negotiating leverage. Tariffs, or the threat of them, give the US a bargaining chip, a way to pressure other countries into opening their own markets or changing practices the US considers unfair. Reason 4, tax revenue. Tariffs are one of the fastest ways for a government to raise money. The tax gets collected the moment goods cross the border. There's none of the multi-year legislative fighting that usually comes with other tax changes. All 4 of those reasons are genuinely part of the policy conversation. Whether tariffs actually deliver on them is a separate question. We'll come back to that. For now, let's follow the domino effect, the one that turns a single tariff into a broader price increase across the entire economy. It rarely stops at the one product that got taxed directly. Here's why. Say a tariff hits imported steel specifically. That steel doesn't just go into steel products. It goes into car parts. It goes into appliances. It goes into the machines that make other products. Raise the cost of one widely used input, and something happens. You raise the cost of everything built with that input, even products that were never directly targeted by any tariff at all. Shipping adds another layer. Companies facing higher costs sometimes stockpile inventory ahead of a new tariff to beat the deadline before the new rate kicks in. That stockpiling creates its own bottlenecks. Warehouse shortages, higher short-term shipping costs, another small price bump stacked on top of the tariff itself. Then there's the psychological piece. Some retailers raise prices in anticipation of a tariff before it's even officially in effect, simply because they expect costs to rise and don't want to be caught behind the curve. Put all of that together, and here's what happens. A single 20% tariff on one category of goods can ripple outward into a broader, slower wave of price increases across categories that were never the original target. So which products actually get hit first and hardest? The data on this is pretty specific. Consumer electronics, prices up roughly 18% in the short run. That's based on Yale Budget Lab's most recent modeling. Though some categories carry a temporary exemption that softened the blow. Clothing and footwear, among the hardest hit categories overall. Apparel and leather goods carry some of the highest tariff exposure of any consumer category. There's a real human story behind that number. One shopper, interviewed by the AP, used to buy $5 to $25 dresses and tops from the Chinese fast fashion site Temu. Products from sites like that now face steep new tariffs. She said she got tired of clothes that fell apart after one wash anyway, and toys that broke easily. Now she shops elsewhere and says she doesn't mind paying more if it means better quality. Not everyone shares that view, but it shows the tariff story isn't purely abstract for people living it. Furniture. This is the extreme case. Upholstered furniture tariffs have climbed toward 30%. Kitchen cabinets and bathroom vanities have been pushed as high as 50% in some proposals. Vehicles, prices up around 12% in the short run. That's before accounting for the extra cost automakers absorb on imported steel and aluminum for cars assembled domestically. Toys, heavily exposed. A huge share of U.S. toys are manufactured in China specifically. with few domestic alternatives at comparable price points. Across all categories combined, Yale's Budget Lab has run the numbers. The average American household is absorbing somewhere between $900 and $1,500 a year in added costs. The exact figure depends on which tariffs get extended and which are allowed to expire. The average effective U.S. tariff rate right now sits at roughly 10 to 14%. That's the highest it's been since the 1940s. There's a broader economic cost too, beyond individual prices. Yale's modeling estimates tariffs are slowing U.S. real GDP growth by about 0.4 percentage points this year. Over the long run, that adds up to an economy that's persistently 0.3% smaller. That's the equivalent of roughly $100 billion a year. In today's dollars, the unemployment rate is also projected to rise slightly because of this, by roughly 0.6 to 0.7 percentage points. So, do tariffs actually work? Here's the honest, balanced answer. Serious economists land on both sides of this. The case for tariffs working: they are, without question, effective at raising government revenue quickly. They have accelerated a real shift in where companies manufacture goods. There's measurable movement toward Vietnam, India, and Mexico. There's also some genuine reshoring back to the U.S. in specific sectors like batteries and semiconductors. One 2025 industry study predicted that 40% of U.S. companies would relocate at least part of their supply chains to North America by 2026. They do give U.S. negotiators a credible threat to bring to trade talks, even if the actual results of those talks have been mixed. The case against: multiple independent studies have looked for a manufacturing employment boost. One widely cited analysis from the American Enterprise Institute found little to no measurable increase in U.S. manufacturing jobs as a direct result of the tariffs. The Supreme Court actually struck down a significant portion of the broadest tariffs in February 2026. It ruled they exceeded the executive branch's legal authority. The administration has since replaced them with narrower tariffs under a different legal framework. Independent research from the Minneapolis Federal Reserve looked closely at this too. They found that tariffs alone can't explain most of the recent rise in goods prices. Some of the increase reflects retailers raising prices in anticipation of tariffs. Some of it reflects AI-driven demand pushing electronics prices up for entirely separate reasons. Two different forces, both pushing prices upward at the same time. Easy to mistake for one. Economists across the political spectrum broadly agree on one thing: American companies and consumers have paid the large majority of the actual cost, not foreign exporters. So the honest answer: tariffs partially work at some of their stated goals. They fall short on others, and the cost of pursuing them lands overwhelmingly on the American side of the transaction. Now, where does this go from here? A few things are worth watching closely. China. The tariff gap between China and alternative manufacturing hubs has widened sharply. Back in January 2025, that gap was around 7 percentage points. Today, it's as much as 24 to 30 percentage points. For context, China's trade-weighted tariff rate now sits around 41%. Vietnam's sits at 18%. Thailand's at 16%. Malaysia's at just 11%. That gap is the single biggest driver of the manufacturing shift happening right now. It's not closing anytime soon. Europe. The EU has been building its own tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles specifically. Companies are already responding. Volvo, for example, is reportedly shifting EV production from China to Belgium, directly in response to those EU tariffs. Expect more of this pattern globally, not less. Supply chains. Southeast Asia's overall share of global manufacturing sourcing jumped sharply in a single year, from about 30% to 54%, led by Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia. But this isn't a clean win for those countries either. Vietnam's own trade officials have warned about the risk. Rising costs there could push some orders further away, to Cambodia, Indonesia, or Bangladesh instead. An endless chain of next cheapest option. Many companies are now running what's called a China Plus One strategy, keeping some production in China, while diversifying the rest across multiple countries at once, specifically so no single tariff decision can hit their entire supply chain. AI and energy. This connects back to something bigger than trade policy. AI-driven demand for chips, electronics, and data centers is growing fast. That demand competes for the exact same global supply chains tariffs are also disrupting, which means something worth remembering. Some price pressure people are currently blaming on tariffs may actually be coming from somewhere else entirely, a completely different source, layered right on top of the tariff story. So how should you, personally, actually prepare for this? You don't need to become a trade economist to do it. This isn't investment advice, and it doesn't need to be. It's simpler than that. Watch which categories get named specifically in new tariff announcements. That tells you which prices are likely to move first, usually within a few months. Watch for companies announcing supply chain shifts. That usually signals a price change is already baked in, even before it shows up on a store shelf. Watch the exemption lists closely. Those change often. A product that's expensive today might get a temporary reprieve tomorrow, or the reverse. None of this requires predicting the future. It just requires knowing where to actually look. Tariffs aren't just a political story that happens somewhere else, disconnected from your life, safely contained in the news. They reach all the way into the grocery store, into your next phone upgrade, into the car you're thinking about buying. The real question was never whether a tariff gets imposed. It's who ends up paying for it.